Hi there, you're listening to the Hellenistic Age Podcast, Episode 100, Q&A Session Number 2, Electric Boogaloo. Well, here we are, 100 episodes since we first started in late April of 2018. Though that's just a formality. I think there are 130 shows if we include interviews and some bonus episodes. But nevertheless, I consider it an achievement that we've gotten this far. Since releasing episode 50 in August 2020, I've had a couple of milestones with the show. The podcast has been downloaded over 3 million times as of this September. I've had the privilege to travel out of the country for some in-person research in Italy, Greece, and Turkey. I was kindly invited as a guest to other podcasts and channels, contributed a couple of articles about the Hellenistic period, presented at virtual conferences, and even got an interview with the Greek reporter about my work. Of course, none of this would have been possible without your support these last number of years, so thank you all so much for your time, dedication, and effort in helping me with my show. The last 50 episodes have also seen a diverse range of topics. Timeline-wise, we went from roughly 245 BC down to 180 BC. On paper, this doesn't seem terribly long, but this includes such intense events like the Fourth Syrian War, the Social War, the Second Punic War, the Great Revolt of Egypt, the Anabasis of Antiochus III, the First and Second Macedonian Wars, the Fifth Syrian War, and the Romano-Seleucid War. I don't know if you could tell that there was a running theme going on, but we did talk about other special topics, deep dives into the Seleucid and Ptolemaic kingdoms, Hellenistic literature, science and technology, and a very lengthy digression on the Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kingdoms. With an approximate end date of 30 BC, you might be wondering about how long it might take to cover the remaining 150 years. Truthfully, I can't give a straight answer, as I find that my show becomes more complex as I do more research. But from intuition, I would say that we will be moving along the timeline a little faster than what we did before. Sources for the Hellenistic kingdom become spotty during the mid to late 2nd century, since we are going to lose both Polybius and Livy when we reach 146 BC, so there is less material to go through. I won't have as many digressions like with literature, science, or the Hellenistic Far East, which will keep us more on pace and keep the narrative flowing. That doesn't mean there aren't going to be special topic episodes, just less of them, or maybe some that are more self-contained. Let me present to you our approximate timeline for the next several episodes. We will first cover the final years of the Antigonid dynasty, with the reigns of Philip V and Perseus down to the Third Macedonian War. Next, we will return to the Seleucid Empire to cover Seleucus IV and the early reign of Antiochus IV, before moving on to the Sixth Syrian War. After this point, we will jump to the Maccabean Revolt and Hellenistic Judea, then back to the Ptolemies and Seleucids, which will become increasingly chaotic as we move towards the latter half of the 2nd century. With that all in mind, let us get to our second question and answer episode. I am categorizing these based on similar themes based on questions you all provided, so why don't we start with the ones that are show production related. From Greg from the Popular History Podcast. What have you learned over the course of doing your show that has surprised you the most? Probably the most surprising aspect was just how much more invested I've become in the Hellenistic period over the history of Rome. When I started the show, I knew a lot more about Rome than virtually any other place in the ancient world, or pretty much any other topic of history. As time has gone by, I've become totally engrossed with the Hellenistic world, and have begun to lose interest once Rome moves into the Principate. I had a completely different mindset when I started the podcast, but as I've been going along, I just become more engrossed to the point where I'm not really reading any books that falls outside of the period. This is kind of a problem when it comes to actually trying to explore different avenues or different periods. But it does make buying books for me for Christmas for my family and friends a lot easier, so that is one positive. From Vinicius Crispim 3741. Do you know how to read ancient Greek? Or are you interested in learning it? Do you know any other languages? Does anyone help you produce the podcast script? Unfortunately, I do not know how to read ancient Greek. Surprising, maybe, but you've heard my pronunciations. Given the number of loanwords there are in scientific terminology, I was able to pick up a few here and there during my undergrad, and having now worked on the podcast for a number of years, and by repeated exposure to inscriptions and coins, I've been able to more easily recognize certain phrases or expressions when I read them in their original form. This is very different from being able to understand Attic, Koine, or Byzantine Greek, of course. Actually, I have been learning modern Greek to prepare for my trips in the country through the language course available on Duolingo. My first time in Greece was still a little rough, but after another 5 months of practice, my skills had really improved for my second visit to Thessaloniki. I wasn't discussing philosophy or politics, mind you, but I was able to at least amuse the local restaurants and shopkeepers by ordering food or asking for directions entirely with Greek with reasonably clear pronunciation. Indirectly, this has been useful because the characters used in the Greek alphabet have been pretty consistent over the last few thousand years, which in turn helps me in reading ancient Greek texts. I would like to learn ancient Greek in the future, along with Latin, but it is a matter of time allocation that serves to be the biggest problem. I wish Duolingo would add Attic or Koine as a module, which I could easily fit into my normal routine of learning another language on my walks or at the gym. But for the second part of your question, no, I am a one-man band and do everything from research to editing to map making. Sometimes this is more obvious than others because I'm not a master of everything or even a master of certain things. But a few years ago, there was a period of time when I had a counterpart who was kind enough to help me review my scripts to improve my skills as a writer. After that period, I was able to get back and do it on my own terms and have been taking charge of everything since then. However, I have been relying on the work of other amazing people that has made my research a lot simpler. I'd like to give a shout out to Adam Smith from atlas.org for providing an accessible collection of sources that has been a huge help in organizing my timelines and making research far more efficient. lacuscurtius.org, livius.org, perseus.org. All of these websites provide helpful guides and sources free of charge for the general public. They have been instrumental in allowing me to do my show in a more efficient manner. I would say that I think I will actually compile a list of all useful resources and share them on the website, so putting that on my to-do list, but those are just some of the resources I feel that I should call out. From Trevor Callahan of the History of the Celts podcast. In your early days of the podcast, did you ever feel any type of imposter syndrome related to being new to the scene or because you did not feel qualified enough to do a podcast? If so, have you gotten over it? How? To be honest, I've never really had a sense of imposter syndrome from my work. I mean, there have been moments where I've been disappointed with the quality or elements of the show that I retroactively would have liked to have improved on. Going back to those early episodes is a brutal endeavor for me and something I don't often do. I've always interpreted it as a growing pain that comes with any project. And if anything, I think it shows how much I've grown as a writer or an editor or a narrator when I look to the quality of what I was producing then versus what I've been doing now. What has helped is that since the beginning, I've been very dedicated to providing as many sources as possible and also being transparent with how I'm coming up with my arguments and overall narrative. Or my logic is that my show is, in theory, supposed to be a well-balanced and detailed look at the Hellenistic period to introduce people to the topic, but not necessarily overwhelm them. If people really wanted to delve more into a subject that I only talk about for about 45 minutes or so, I make it pretty clear where they can go if they want to challenge my framework or do more digging on their own end. I am no expert, but I do hold myself pretty accountable as much as I can since I really want to be able to take this research and apply it to future endeavors like book writing without having to go back and basically relearn things all over again. From Jorrit Deluct, what do you think is the origin of our passion for history? Is it the entertainment value in experiencing dramatic stories that truly happened? Or perhaps a form of escapism away from the modern world? Or is it the sense of achievement that we get from studying to expand our scholarly knowledge? Or do we feel enriched by the nuggets of practical wisdom we find? I certainly think it could be all of the above. Learning about history, and the ancient world in particular, is simultaneously a passion project, a relaxing pastime, and a form of self-improvement. Art imitates life, and the experiences of real people are often more entertaining to me than anything that could be imagined in fiction. Larger-than-life personalities, political intrigue, family squabbles, exploration, war and peace, and so on and so forth. Modern authors really lift characters straight out of the pages of Plutarch or Herodotus for their own stories. That's always something that I always felt that like an alternative history or even historical fiction doesn't really appeal to me as much in the sense of a book versus like maybe watching a historical fiction account on television or a movie. Of course, history is not really so straightforward as reading Herodotus and assuming that he's correct about everything. The nature of it being an investigation into the past in order to reconstruct events or periods adds another layer of complexity, like trying to build a puzzle when all the pieces aren't really there. It really is a great exercise in thought and critical thinking. Of course, there's something valuable to be learned by understanding the broad range of experiences that humanity has undergone in the last 5,000 years of recorded history. The struggles that peoples from various cultures and backgrounds have faced and how they overcame or succumbed to them, or the ways that societies interact and transform over many decades and centuries. Escapism is not necessarily a bad thing either. I'll freely admit, I totally get engrossed while listening to the soundtrack of Gladiator or anonymously engage in petty debates about ancient Rome on forums and websites. But you have to just learn to temper your enthusiasm and not let it control your life, or at least be more self-critical while doing so. From Sly, I am happy to see all the traveling you've done. I'm sure it really makes history come to life. That being said, what has been your favorite places to visit so far? Where do you feel history had come to life the most, in your personal opinion? And just for fun, what are the top 3 places you still wish to go to? Since our last Q&A in episode 50, I've had the privilege of traveling on 4 separate occasions to abroad, visiting Italy, Greece, Turkey, and Greece again. For that, I've never really had the opportunity to travel outside of North America until I could really afford to do so. COVID didn't help either, but when I was finally able to visit Italy in September 2022, I caught the travel bug and fell in love with going abroad and traveling and gaining that experience. If I were to pick one spot from each visit, it would probably go something a little like this. In Italy, Rome speaks for itself. There's so much to explore here, and museums are incredible. The layout is, you're always going to bump into something exciting and fascinating. Also, the food is amazing too, so that's always a positive. But rather than the Colosseum really standing out to me, I found myself gravitating towards the Forum. The scale of it and that sense of landscape is what I feel was way more impressive than the magnificence of the Colosseum, which was cool. I do like Gladiator, obviously. I also did visit Pompeii and Herculaneum in a single day, which I really don't recommend unless you absolutely have to. But I did have the opportunity to sit in the theater of Pompeii with a copy of Pliny the Younger's letters, reading the passage of him describing the eruption of Vesuvius and the death of his uncle Pliny the Elder. It was pretty surreal reading his account on like a beautiful September morning with the volcano looming in the background of a long buried city, which is so well preserved. And that was kind of a magical moment. I try to do something like that on every trip. In Greece, on my first visit, I went to Athens and the surrounding areas, covering the city itself and making side trips to Delphi, Corinth, and Aegina. The Acropolis was awesome, speaks for itself, and especially as I got in on the first day I was there, which was about the crack of dawn on a Sunday, as I was standing on the top of the Acropolis admiring the Parthenon, you had Orthodox liturgies echoing across the city while I was alone. So that was a really unique experience, kind of crossing the centuries. But I think that the award in terms of favorite places probably is going to go to Delphi. I walked up and down the ruins with my copy of Pausanias, reading his description of ancient Delphi, which was a magical experience since it was raining a bit outside and the mists were rolling over the Mount Parnassus and the landscape surrounding the area. You could really feel the religious nature of this sanctuary and why so many people would flock there throughout the centuries to visit the oracles and pay their tributes and whatnot. Seriously, if you are in Athens, please make time for Delphi if you can. In September 2023, I went and visited Turkey. Along with Istanbul, I did have an itinerary that took me up and down the western coastline of Turkey, which is about the Izmir province and a little bit of the surrounding area. This was only for a few days, so it was a little bit compact. Ephesus was great. Priene was a pleasant surprise, but I think Pergamon was the peak. No pun intended. It's about 2 hours north of Izmir, and I took a gondola up to the Acropolis and had the place entirely to myself. The views are spectacular, the theater is dizzyingly steep to walk up, and it was really the first time I truly got a feel for something so relevant to the Hellenistic period. My only regret was doing an episode on Pergamon before I visited, so I wish I could have better explained the sensation of being on the city side and sharing all the photos I took. But a second place probably goes to the Belevi Mausoleum, which is a large tomb just outside of Ephesus. You basically have to crawl your way into to visit. It's often missed by travelers who are heading to Ephesus and belong to a Antigonid or Seleucid king, most likely. So it's cool to see this royal tomb of a Hellenistic monarch just kind of abandoned on the countryside. It felt more like a true archaeologist moment than anything else I've gone so far. Lastly, there was my second trip to Greece, which is this past March, when I visited Thessaloniki and the surrounding regions, so Pella, Vergina, Amphipolis, Philippi, and Dion. Generally speaking, the tomb of Vergina and the palace of Philip II is going to be the best overall spot to visit, but Dion was really unique because it was the religious sanctuary of the Macedonian kingdom and had a really great atmosphere to it. You have Mount Olympus in the background, partially submerged temples, and lots of lush greenery. One of the weirdest moments was hearing all the frogs croaking in the Temple of Isis, which is like halfway submerged in a swamp. Obviously, I know what a frog sounds like, but the ones in my neck of the woods are way deeper. Think of a bullfrog. But the ones in Dion had actually matched the description of Aristophanes perfectly with the brekikekekek noise that they were echoing, so that was a little surreal when I first heard that. While I would like to spend my days traveling the Mediterranean and beyond, I'm really limited by travel and the costs of flying across the ocean from the United States. So if I were to pick 3 realistic destinations I would like to go to, they would be as follows. Number 1, Egypt. It's Egypt. Do I need to say more? I mean, you have Cairo, Memphis, Alexandria, Colombo, the opportunity to sail up the Nile, visit the pyramids, see all the monuments from ancient, Old Kingdom and New Kingdom Egypt, and then also a few pieces of evidence from the Hellenistic period and Roman period. It's a dream destination for a reason. It's going to be, it requires more time just because there's so much to do. So it may not be for a couple of years or so, but I'd like to visit it before I really finish the series and Story with Cleopatra. Second would be Jordan. I've heard nothing but great things from people who visited the country. Petra, and there are fantastic ruins in Jerash and Amman as well. I mean, between Egypt and Jordan, I've never visited a desert before, so going to one of these spots would be a refreshing change for me. And then lastly would be Turkey again. I really only scratched the surface of my visits when I went about a year ago. There is still a ton left to explore on that western coastline. You have Aphrodisias, Hierapolis, Magnesia, Didyma, Halicarnassus, just to name a few. And then in eastern Turkey, you have Antioch, Laodicea, Zeugma, and of course Mount Nemrut, with the ruins of Antiochus I of Commagene. This is not a comprehensive list, and I could spend a month driving around the countryside and hit a different place each day. And of course, there are other regions of the world that I would absolutely love to visit, so me not including them is not intended to be a snub, but these are what are likely to be my itinerary across the next few years. From Marcus, when are you going to make more reading guides? Soon. I currently have 3 guides, one on the Ptolemies, one on the Seleucids, and one on Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greeks. I plan on making one for the Antigonids and post-Alexandrian Macedonia and Greece, and probably a few others as we go along further through the period. Probably something like the Black Sea or Pontus, or maybe even something to do with the Hellenistic Judea. So I do plan on making more. It's just a matter of time before I really get to those parts. From Nabisan, 1988, When are you going to cover the Hasmonean dynasty in Israel? The Hasmoneans, and by extension the Maccabees, is something that is going to be tackled in early 2025, probably starting in episode 106 onwards. I'm asked this question very often, which isn't really surprising given that it is one of the most famous events of the entire Hellenistic period, given its extensive accounts in the Old Testament. However, I really wanted to make sure that we covered the reign of Antiochus IV before I dealt with Maccabean revolt, since it marks as something of a turning point for the Seleucids before we really get caught up in the whirlwind of the civil wars that really dominated the 2nd century. Plus, the Day of Eleusis in 168 serves as a great place to pause our narrative. In terms of a layout, I plan on discussing the biblical sources, Daniel, Maccabees, and the writings of Josephus, then cover the history of Judea and the experience of the Jews during the Hellenistic period from Alexander to Antiochus, and then lead into the Maccabean revolt and the establishment of the Hasmonean kingdom as the Seleucid realm begins to fragment. From Igor Hendricks, I would like to know more about the quote-unquote smaller Hellenistic states, Pergamon, Bithynia, and learning more about the use of mercenaries in the Hellenistic age. To answer your first question, I have a list of locations I plan on covering as we move into the middle of the 2nd century BC, since they either become more prominent in the narrative or are thematically appropriate as we move forward in the timeline. This list is not exhaustive, but I do have ideas for the following: the Mithridatic Kingdom of Pontus, the Orontids and Artaxiads of Armenia, the Kingdom of Bithynia, the Parthian Empire, the Hellenistic Persian Gulf, including Charakene, Elymais, and Persis, the Nabateans, Hasmonean Judea, Meroitic Nubia and the Ptolemaic Red Sea, the Numidian Kingdom, and the Kingdom of Commagene. Some will receive more time dedicated than others, but these are by and large what I would like to spend an episode on in some capacity. For your second question, I don't think I will be doing an episode exclusively about mercenaries or military-focused episodes per se. That is something that is covered here and there in the podcast narrative, but not really one I want to be dedicating the entire episode to. What I would suggest, though, is 2 separate podcasts who do delve into that topic quite a bit. There is first Ancient World Magazine, which has an episode titled Mercenaries in the Ancient World, and as well as Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast, which has a couple of them that talks more about it. So I will actually put a link into that in the episode description if you want to take a look at those. But that's pretty much where I'm at in terms of that topic. From Gamer's Sanctum, can you do an episode on the food they would typically consume? I heard that food looked different back then. Did they actually eat healthy enough to have some people actually look similar to the grand physique of their statues? Also, maybe go over extinct plants and animals like the Silphium plant. Food in the Hellenistic world is actually a pretty interesting idea. I think there is a lot that could be said about it in conjunction with nutrition, agricultural practices, economics, and medicine, and probably a whole bunch of other tangential topics. Whether marble statues present a realistic physique is a complicated question. I actually have a fair bit of knowledge about the history of fitness and bodybuilding thanks to my exposure to the online fitness community. Content creators like More Plates, More Dates, Jack PGM, and others, so do give those a watch. The earliest bodybuilders like Eugene Sandow and Bernard McFadden modeled their physiques on Greek and Roman statues, and this was before the invention and widespread use of steroids. This all was taking place in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These men differed philosophically in their nutritional outlook, but they probably had a more reliable and diverse source of protein and vegetables than the average peasant or athlete in the ancient world, in addition to generally better healthcare. Statues of gods and heroes were probably an ideal for the Greeks and Romans, and while there are instances of soldiers and athletes displaying phenomenal levels of endurance and strength, their physiques were probably not cultivated for what we would call aesthetics. They had a limited understanding of the exercise sciences that permeates fitness culture today, about the same level for nutrition. We do have evidence of the food regimen of boxers, wrestlers, and gladiators, but they seem to be carb and meat heavy, which tends to add overall bulk and not as much definition of what you think of as a shredded, Hollywood-esque, muscle-bound performer. This is not to say that they shared a physique of the Farnese Hercules or Kyriakos Grizzly, but they were intended to build strength and mass rather than looking like a more modern bodybuilder like Ziz or Arnold Schwarzenegger. And these individuals would have been a small subset of the population with privileged access to diets like that. So I would say as a whole, there was a possibility, but it would have been very, very small and not necessarily something that was terribly common. From Heyo6050, could you in detail discuss more about Pergamon and Rhodes regarding administration, urban layout, and culture? I covered Pergamon in episode 86, and they will feature throughout the next several episodes as we move through the 2nd century. Rhodes will appear here and there as well, but I don't really have any plans to dive deeper into their layout and organization, at least for the moment. Again, Pergamon's going to be a key player as we move forward. Rhodes is in the background, but I don't really have planning on doing a singular episode about them. From Thessacredi, the 342, I'm sorry if I butchered that pronunciation, would love to see a video of Alexander's multiple wives and how he would deal with them. Unfortunately, I can't say that there's too much to talk about with regards to Alexander's wives. We know the most about Roxana, but outside of some light commentary by Plutarch suggesting that she was a love match or she poisoned her rivals, there's nothing really to talk about her personality. The rest of his wives have even less information about them, and as a whole, I don't really plan on going back to the Alexandrian period unless it is absolutely necessary. So, unfortunately, no, I don't have any plans to do anything at this time. To the next section here, we're going to talk more about some media-related questions. Now, let me read off these first 3 questions since they all sort of interlink with one another. From Tomasz Takach, what would you say about the Game of Thrones series based on the Diadochoi era, with the opening scene as Alexander is dying on the bed with the generals around him, and the ending scene of the series with Ptolemy at the same spot? Thank you for the podcast. The second question is from Roberto of the History of Sakartvelo, Georgia, and Tsar Power podcasts. Who would you cast in a series about the Diadochoi, and what provider would it be on? Who would direct it? And thirdly, from Ethan of Play History. What would you do with an Alexander the Great series if you oversaw its structure? I've expressed my enjoyment and frustrations with the Oliver Stone Alexander film from 2004, and acknowledge that his life would probably be better suited for a miniseries than even a 3-hour epic. If Alexander is to be the center focus, I think I would imitate what was done by the team who did the HBO Rome TV series, where you have Alexander and the court members doing their thing from childhood until his death in Babylon, but you also have some original characters like the Macedonian equivalent of a Lucius Vorenus or Titus Pullo, your rank-and-file troops who can offer a ground-level perspective of the campaigns from start to finish. Or you follow the approach of John Adams and make Alexander the central star, but cover everything using him and his relationships with characters like Hephaestion or Ptolemy or Olympias as the running theme. With the Wars of the Diadochoi, I think that there is a lot more to work with. I would start the series off with Alexander's death, but keep Alexander hidden and never show his face. Each successor could have a storyline, and you would have Alexander taking on different personas as he's remembered differently by those men. The angry drunk Alexander, the kind and generous Alexander, the scholarly and pathos-driven Alexander, which would all be equally valid based on the memory of those men and kind of act as a way to reconcile the sources' differences in the way they portray the man. James Rom's Ghost on the Throne could serve as the narrative model, and there is just enough information missing to allow for artistic liberties in events and dialogues. In terms of a provider, I would probably stick with HBO since they have the best track record for historical TV series. Directing is a bit tricky since TV directors have very different skill sets from film directors, but I would love to see Robert Eggers tackle the period. He did an awesome job on The Northman and The Witch, and seems very devoted to historical authenticity and incorporating the mythology of their settings into it, which would lend itself well to the strangeness of accounts like Plutarch's anecdotes, the ghostly visits of Alexander, the visions allegedly experienced like Seleucus, and the romances of what they tell. So I think there is potential in that regards. I don't know if I could really give a good answer with, who would I cast? I haven't really thought about it too hard. Probably again relying on some of the HBO characters. I think that Anthony Hopkins as Old Ptolemy was great from the Alexander movie, but that's pretty much all I would suggest at this moment, is something akin to that. Worst case scenario, an adult animated series would be probably a good choice as well, given the expensive nature of building sets and costumes and hiring extras to match that scale. It would also free up some limitations of trying to account for that, so that is an alternative route, but nothing that it would be excessive to really expand on. Now let's move on to questions pertaining to historical topics, things we maybe covered on the show, are yet to cover, and everything in between. So, starting off with the first question by Chris Amon, 4551, not exactly on topic for the Hellenistic age, but still an ancient question. Were Homer's Greeks the sea peoples who caused the Bronze Age collapse? In the Iliad 9, Achilles boasts, quote, 12 cities of men I've stormed and sacked from shipboard, 11 I claim by land, and he is just one Greek warlord. And then the archaeological evidence shows the Mycenaean Greek influence expanding to Crete and Turkey and Palestine. I've heard of the theory that suggests that the Sea Peoples were raiders from the recently collapsed Mycenaean kingdoms, but I'm not an expert in the Bronze Age to give my own 2 cents worth anything. People often try to make connections within the Iliad and Odyssey as evidence of a cultural memory of the late Bronze Age. I think there are some interesting examples, namely the archaeological discovery of boar tusk helmets in Mycenaean graves, which is mentioned in the Iliad as the equipment of Meriones, and most famously Heinrich Schliemann's rediscovery of Mycenae and Troy. Nuggets of truth might appear here and there, but most elements of the Homeric epics tend to be reflective of the culture in the Greek Dark Ages, or perhaps if you want to call it the early Archaic, rather than anything Bronze Age. There's actually a good article on this I read a couple of months ago on badancient.com, which talks about this very topic. From Trevor Callahan of the History of Celts podcast. There is a real divide between scholars related to the reliability of Herodotus, some who think he was a terrible historian, while others think he was invaluable in the creation of history as a field of study. Barring your own feelings towards Herodotus, are there other ancient authors that you think are less reliable as a narrator when coming to describing events? If so, which authors are those, and do you feel stuck using them? Now, I'm something of a Herodotus advocate. I tend to find him endlessly fascinating to read when compared to someone like Thucydides, who is objectively a better historian per se, but with each new year comes some new archaeological discovery that validates his testimony about the stuff he claims to have personally seen. All accounts are going to be biased to some capacity, and even if we don't think they're intentionally lying to us, they may be presenting a version we just can't investigate further. So we often just have to accept it for what it is and acknowledge its shortcomings. Polybius, of course, is the gold standard, but even he is prone to painting a story when it pertains to certain areas or events. Plutarch's anecdote-filled biographies don't really stand up to rigorous scrutiny, but he is entirely honest about them not being a clear and concise history, and his anecdotes are genuinely entertaining, and I think we're better for it than without them. Livy is a staunch Roman patriot and is all too happy to paint the Romans in a good light, but he uses good sources and is self-aware of what he's doing, and is also a fantastic writer. Because we are so limited to what we have, classicists and ancient historians will never entirely throw away all the sources because there is something to be gained from them, even in an indirect sort of way. That being said, I think that there are some authors that I am less than satisfied with. Justin's epitome of Pompeius Trogus is incredibly frustrating. It is one of the only accounts to provide a continuous summary of events from Philip II to Augustus, not just for the Greeks and Romans, but also for the world outside of that, including the Parthians and the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, which has preserved many secondary sources we otherwise would have lost. The problem is that, being an epitome, Justin shorthands Trogus's very large universal history into a comparatively small summary. What makes it more aggravating is that he frequently gets names wrong, mixes up events, and when he does insert himself into Trogus's work, he just moralizes. But he is the only source we have in many situations, so by process of elimination, he remains a key resource for me, but you always have to take his opinion with a grain of salt. From Ben Santos: when are you going to mention how Darius III used Kynoskephali against Alexander the Great? Yet after the Battle of Gaugamela, the Macedonian king recruited them. That is, Alexander III used Kynoskephali, or werewolf dog-headed men, as mercenaries into his own army to invade the East. Talk about epic. And no one ever speaks up about this anymore? To be completely honest, when I first read this question, I was legitimately confused because I have never heard any version of Alexander's life involving werewolves, which would really only be slightly weirder than what he gets up to in the Alexander romance. Coincidentally, I do have a copy of Daniel Ogden's The Werewolf in the Ancient World, and while I can't seem to find any references to something about Gaugamela, he does cite an Armenian version of the romance which has the Macedonian king tell a story about his adventures in Media and the possible encounter with werewolves. Quote, "Then there appeared to us, about 9 or 10 o'clock, a man as hairy as a goat, and once again I was startled and disturbed to see such beasts. I thought of capturing the man, for he was ferociously and brazenly barking at us. And I ordered a woman to undress and go to him on the chance that he might be vanquished by lust. But he took the woman and went far away, where, in fact, he ate her. And he roared and made strange noises with his thick tongue at all our men, who had run forth to reach her and to set her free. And when his other comrades heard him, countless myriads of them attacked us from the brushes. There were 40,000 of us, so I ordered that the brushes be set afire. And when they saw the fire, they turned and fled. And we pursued them, and tied up 400,000 of them, but they died since they refused to eat, and they did not have human reason, but, rather, barked wildly like dogs." End quote. So that is the only reference in the Alexandrian tradition to sort of a werewolf. I'm curious to hear more about this, but what you just heard was utterly bizarre and it sounds crazy, but that's just the nature of the beast, and no pun intended, of Alexandrian romances in general. So, interesting question. Did not expect that answer to come through, but here we are. From Jort Deluct: do you believe it is possible for a single person to achieve as much renown here and now as Alexander did in his day? By what means could you see that thing being achieved? Would the same actions that made Alexander such a legendary figure be celebrated in the same way if they were carried out today? What does that say about our current day culture compared to ancient times? What consequence does this have for people who admire Alexander and strive to use him as a role model today? I would say that it is generally a good thing that we don't seem to live in an age where an Alexander the Great-esque character would thrive. Even for the time, Alexander's campaigns and the subsequent breakdown of his empire caused significant casualties and chaos across much of the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond for several decades. Personality-wise, he was capable of being generous and eruditious as much as he was temperamental and vengeful. I'm endlessly fascinated by the man and the consequences of his actions, and definitely find a lot of attributes to him, definitely I would say admirable, or he's charismatic, but I would not want to be anywhere remotely near the receiving end of one of his campaigns, or witness the scale of political upheaval that such an ambitious personality would have on the modern world. The historian John Keegan wrote a book about military leadership, and compared the varying styles of Alexander, the Duke of Wellington, Ulysses S. Grant, and Adolf Hitler. Now, he doesn't suggest that Alexander was some sort of proto-Hitler archetype, but one of his big points at the end of the book was how utterly horrible his style of leadership would be in a post-nuclear age. In a time where the nuclear deterrent is pretty much one step away from ensuring global annihilation, leaders must seek to de-escalate as much as possible and find alternative solutions than open warfare, what he calls a post-heroic style. Following the framework proposed by Arthur Eckstein, diplomacy in the ancient world was extremely blunt or non-existent when compared to how modern nation-states interact. Thankfully, I do think the values of our time have downplayed the importance of being a conqueror or military victor to be labeled as a renowned leader. They tend to emphasize social, economic, and general political stability over the glory of crushing your enemies. And when they do emphasize military victories, it tends to be in the framework of defending your people rather than conquering others. That would be the case in Alexander, and I am pretty much of the opinion that you don't really want an Alexander running around in a modern day setting. It would cause a lot of problems for us. But in the context of his own time, he was still an intimidating person to be around, given the force that he carried with him. But as a personality, I can see why he is so appealing. From Roman of 2002, how is Alexander remembered today in the Middle East? That is a complex question that ties very much into modern politics. I don't really have many contacts in the Iranian diaspora or any other community associated with the Middle East to get a general consensus, but it varies from place to place and even from time to time. Using Iran as our example, in the pre-Islamic period, Alexander is described in Zoroastrian text as Alexander the Accursed. What a great name. Given his actions at Persepolis and the wholesale invasion of the Persian Empire. In the medieval period, Alexander is described as a son of Darius in the Persian epic Shahnameh, which is more positively inclined, but still tries to rationalize Alexander as being a legitimate king of Persia by making him half Persian. By the modern day, Alexander has seemed to have swung back in a negative light, as Iranians are attempting to reassert their ancient heritage of the Achaemenids, which was destroyed by the Macedonian conquests. Other parts of the Middle East, like Egypt or Turkey, tend to be more positively inclined, but it depends on your point of view because Alexander in many ways was seen as a prototype of European colonialist ventures during the late 1800s and early 20th century. And there was a backlash to it. India is a great example of this. There was many pushbacks against the notion of the Indo-Greeks and Alexander the Great. But that's also in part by colonialist powers kind of viewing him as a prototype to follow when moving into these lands in Central Asia or in India. And you also get more of a negative backlash as a result. But some areas are more positively inclined. Again, I have no real pulse on the opinions of Middle Eastern cultures and countries to really get an idea of what they think of Alexander, but that is the general statements I'm making based on what I've seen. Now moving on more specifically to the Hellenistic period, from Carol, what is your favorite Hellenistic kingdom? I think that the Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kingdoms are my favorite to learn about by far, primarily because they are such a mystery, but what information we do get is just so tantalizing. It often encapsulates what I find so interesting about the Hellenistic period. That's the complexity of cultural interactions and exchange, the simultaneous lack of sources, and their diversity of the sources. You have to ground yourself out of that, but you can't help but get carried away by the notion of an Athens in Afghanistan or something like that. It's a very striking image. And having now spent all this time, I do consider my series on Hellenistic Central Asia and India to be the best content I've ever put out for the podcast. It was a very challenging project to tackle, but I think the difficulty in learning it and the ways I was pulling it together made it more interesting for me. And I always am looking for the next great book on the subject to come out. Carrying on from the previous point, from Philip Zahn, 491. Which civilization in the Hellenistic period do you find most interesting, which wasn't part of the wider Greek-influenced world, except Rome? Well, maybe we'll structure this question a little bit differently. If we're talking about a region that wasn't one of the main successor kingdoms, or maybe one of the dominated by a Greek power, I am torn between a couple choices. I'm very excited to talk about the kingdoms of Armenia and Pontus. I'd like to learn more about them since they, and really any, I guess you would call them Persian successor states that is more Iranian in kingship than it is Greco-Macedonian. I also find many of the kingdoms of the East and the powers that they interacted with. So for example, I find the Mauryan Empire extremely interesting because of how much limited information there is. But also, there's not really many places that I'm not excited to talk about, be it the Galatians, kingdoms of Idrisia and Thrace, the Bosporan Greeks, the kingdoms of Meroitic Nubia. Really, I find them all fascinating because I like to just learn more about the period in general. I guess if I were to give it to one group, I've been learning more about the cultures of of Mesopotamia and the Near East. So Palmyrene, the Nabateans, even parts of Syria and Mesopotamia, like the heartlands of Babylonia during the Hellenistic period. Those I've been gravitating towards most recently and been reading quite a few books, especially about pre-Islamic Arabia. There's a lot of interesting information in there, and I will share a couple of books in the episode description to talk more about that. From Berenger_Shavin. What date and what place if you go back in time for one day in the Hellenistic period? Now, I think I answered this in the first episode, but I may need to amend my answer a bit and set certain parameters to make it more of a challenge. Assuming that I head back in time with all my present skills, and am not allowed to keep any physical objects beyond whatever I brought to the past in the first place, and my safety is guaranteed, the factors influencing my decision boil down to A, what gets me the most knowledge to bring back to the present day, and B, what do I find to be the coolest event? I can't read ancient Greek, and since I'm not going to be able to sneak anything back with me, Alexandria would not be my choice, since I can't just steal scrolls from the Great Library and ferret them away to the present. So perhaps I need to be an eyewitness to a society that we know relatively little about. In that case, I Khanum or Alexandria Eshkate during the reign of Eucratides, or Alexandria in the Caucasus, modern Bagram, during the reign of Menander would give me a ton of information about the Bactrian and Indo-Greek kingdoms. It would answer a lot of questions about the layout of the cities at their height, the general makeup of the population, what features were brought over by the Greeks, religious and social aspects, etc. Alternatively, I would suggest the Battle of Magnesia. On top of living out my fantasies from Total War, albeit an extremely gruesome one, there is quite a lot to gain from being an eyewitness to an ancient battle. Firstly, while we know about the general tactics of the Roman legion or the Macedonian pike phalanx, very little information about how a legionary or phalangi would actually fight in melee combat. Was it a series of skirmishes, two blobs pressing against each other till one breaks? I mean, we do have a select few accounts of battles from the perspective of commanders and officers like Xenophon or Julius Caesar, but almost nothing from your rank-and-file combatant. Going back to John Keegan, the earliest written records that we can use to reconstruct a battle from the point of view of the average soldier is the Battle of Agincourt. So witnessing the psychology of men fighting in pre-gunpowder battles would provide pretty good eyewitness evidence to something that hasn't really taken place in many, many centuries for large parts of the world. There's video of riots and whatnot, and there's also, I believe, a documentary done in the 1970s showing warfare between two tribes in Papua New Guinea, but it's a little bit different when it comes to ancient combat. Secondly, by observing the men in question, you can get a good sense of what types of equipment they used in the battle itself. Thirdly, you can also look to see what life in the camps was like. So what sort of followers did it attract? How do they maintain logistics? These are really things that are rarely commented by the ancient accounts, since it was presumed that the reader was already somewhat familiar with the day-to-day operations of running an army, so getting those small little details kind of confirms aspects to us that we have to simply assume but can never confirm. Lastly, I do get to watch a charge of cataphracts, war elephants, scythe chariots. Again, safety is guaranteed, so I'm not particularly worried about being caught in the crossfire. But I would say between those options, that would be what I would like to do if I could go back in time. From Dave Sanford. Of the original successors, who would you consider to be the true heir of Alexander? I'm partial to Seleucus myself, though I'd love to hear the opinion of an expert. The true heir was Alexander IV, but of course that wasn't the question. My answer would have to be Seleucus as well. He was the closest to unifying the empire, held the vast majority of his Asian provinces, remained married to his Sogdian wife Apame, used Babylon as his capital, for a time, founded or refounded many Greek-style cities across Western and Central Asia, was reasonably tolerant of local customs and traditions, to a point, and even invaded India. The ancient authors like Plutarch would probably suggest that Pyrrhus was Alexander's heir in spirit, being so fundamentally similar as a king dedicated to the art of war, but I think Seleucus was the close to embodying everything else. From Gamer's Sanctum, how come we don't have many stories of Lysimachus? I mean, he was the one where you got your portrait for the channel, and he was a big player for the Diadochoi. That's true, Lysimachus was a pretty interesting character, and as you mentioned, is kind of important despite having only a few writers talk about him. There are some interesting anecdotes about Lysimachus that pop up here and there, such as his sarcastic wit when he teased an orator who composed fabricated stories about Alexander's reputed sexual encounters with the Amazons, and he also had a tendency towards anger, as seen when he was mocked by a member of Demetrius Poliarchetes' staff as the treasurer, a euphemism for being a eunuch. He becomes more prominent from the Battle of Ipsus onwards, but it is because he is involved in the stories of Demetrius, Seleucus, Arsinoe II, and Pyrrhus of Epirus. I generally attribute the lack of information and sources about him due to the short-lived Lysimachid dynasty. Perhaps I could have done an episode on him had I delved more into his life when he was focusing on that period, but maybe someday I'll come up with something to try and compensate. From CMG 1892, if Alexander had chosen the successor, would war and fragmentation have been the inevitable outcome anyway? I mean, depending on your point of view, he placed Perdiccas as a standing regent and had a true-born son with his principal wife Roxana. This technically is a succession plan, albeit a very bad and rushed one. If Alexander had committed to having a son early on at the very beginning of his reign, he would have been about 13 or 14 at the time of his death. I think then the empire would have had greater longevity, especially if Alexander was married to a Macedonian noblewoman. Inevitably, some revolts would have occurred in places like Greece or even the Indian satrapies, but they could be dealt with. You would probably see some attempts by the Diadochoi to gain power since they were so incredibly ambitious anyways. But I think that going against a true-born Argead son of 100% Macedonian blood, who was of near adulthood, would have really caused a huge backlash with the army. He was still a bit too young to rule by himself, but Philip V eventually took control around this age. So I think there was potential for it as long as he had the right mentors behind him, and I think there could have been something to it. It definitely would have scaled back what the Diadochoi would have tried attempting to be so brazen about their actions, but these were men that were too ambitious for their own good, and you may have still had the same outcome regardless, but definitely less likely. From Euromantique, what was Cassandra's problem? Why did he act like an anime villain? On the surface, Cassander is easily one of the most hateable of the successors, since he was personally responsible for the death of Alexander's mother, son, and wife, along with the bastard child Eracles, thereby ensuring the destruction of the Argead dynasty. He was kind of a jerk, but then again, so were all these successors, including my main champion, Seleucus. They weren't really very nice or loyal people either. Every one of Cassander's contemporaries had undermined the Argeads and Alexander's legacy, and in my opinion probably would have done the same things as Cassander did had they been the ones in his position. Cassander also had the misfortune of having a short-lived dynasty, and one that was not able to churn out histories and propaganda that would paint his reign in a favorable light. Hieronymus of Cardia worked for the Antigonids, who supplanted the Antipatrids in Macedonia, which continued to rule and build a better reputation over the next 100 years. The only person I would say that I personally detested among all the successors was Ptolemy Keranos, the Thunderbolt, because there's something especially insidious about the betrayal and murder of Seleucus, who gave sanctuary to him and his sister. That just screams another level of violating the laws of hospitality. I think that his actions speak for themselves in the fact he has such a poor reputation in antiquity thereafter. From Heyo 6050. What were the most important cities of the Hellenistic era? What was the municipal organization of those cities? I'll touch on the first question because the second one I kind of covered in detail during the episode on Hellenistic cities and also the episodes pertaining to the Seleucid and Ptolemaic kingdoms. Generally speaking, the most important cities of the Hellenistic period are going to be the administrative and economic capitals of each kingdom. This is because royal power tends to attract the largest number of people, greatest amount of wealth, military centers. Starting off number one would be Alexandria. I mean, it is almost undeniable that it was the most influential city. It was an economic and cultural superpower. It maintained its longevity through its institutions well into the Roman period and became the second city of the Roman Empire for many centuries, and then eventually moved to the third or fourth place, depending on your point of view, once we get to the period of late antiquity. Second probably is going to be Antioch. The Seleucid Empire, even though Antioch does not have maybe the same cultural legacy, and Antioch being another important city for the Roman period, which is also a third or fourth capital, depending on the point of view. Other important cities, Pergamon, same sort of thing. It's important cultural capital, tremendously wealthy, dominates most of Asia Minor for a good century or two. Beyond that, you have Babylon, which was still important, but Seleucia on the Tigris was the administrative capital of Mesopotamia, and where a lot of the activities of the kings of the Seleucids were going into Central Asia and the surrounding areas of Mesopotamia and Iran. From Sotiris Mitsolis 5171, did the Greek city-states of the Western Mediterranean play any significant role in the shaping of the period? Not especially. Massalia, Emporion, and the one area in the Iberian Peninsula were interesting, but not really influential on a grand scale. Perhaps the most notable contribution was by Pytheas of Massalia, who did shape historiography and geography pertaining to Western and Northern Europe for centuries afterwards. But the most important Greek city west of the mainland would have been Syracuse. More so how it interacted with Rome, since it was the first Hellenistic monarchy that they encountered. But the kingdom founded under Agathocles and then the successors, like, say, Hero II, were important economic powers, and they did drive the conflict between Carthage and Rome, which in turn led to the rise of Rome as a major power outside of Italy, and that would be the one. They didn't play really any significant role in the shaping of the period as a whole. From Chunke Chan 4824, what do you think the Hellenistic world would become without the rise of Rome? Are there any other candidates that you think is capable of being the dominant power? Assuming that the Republic never managed to expand outside of Italy, I would bet my money on the Seleucid Empire being the dominant power. I think that the Ptolemies would have had collapsed regardless, especially with an unchecked Philip V and Antiochus III running around without the Romans getting involved. Their survival after the Fifth Syrian War and the Great Revolt was in large part due to their relationship with the Roman Republic, so removing them from the equation would have left the Ptolemies extremely vulnerable. The Antigonids simply lacked the resources to wage war on a scale equivalent to the Seleucids, for even though Philip V was a skilled commander and a good administrator, as we will see in the next episode, I doubt he would have been able to put up as much of a fight had Antiochus III seized Egypt as well. Two wildcards remain, the Carthaginians and the Parthians. If Carthage was able to expand its presence in the western and central Mediterranean, they would have been a serious force to contend with should the Seleucids push west or the Carthaginians push east. Though I think this was beyond their scope and interest, and the two powers may have simply conducted raids against one another. The Parthians were clearly capable of acquiring and maintaining a large empire across Iran, but if the Seleucids were not gripped by infighting and were able to return to their Iranian holdings on a regular basis, then the Parthians potentially could have just been kept a regional power that was subservient to the Seleucid king as a client. You wouldn't have had them taking the opportunity to really expand as they do in that mid to late 2nd century when Seleucid power begins to go haywire in the Mediterranean side. From Dave Sanford, had the Hellenistic world been united by one of the successor kingdoms, would they be able to hold back the Romans? Using Alexander's tactics, was there any way of the successors would dominate the Romans in battle? If you were to believe Livy, then Rome in the late 4th century could have stopped the mighty Alexander. In all seriousness, no. A united Macedonian Empire would pose a formidable threat to the Romans. In fact, I would say that the traditional Macedonian pike phalanx paired with heavy cavalry could have beaten the Romans on the battlefield, even with only a reasonably competent Greek commander. Now, despite the abysmal performance record against the legions, Pyrrhus of Epirus was able to beat the Romans in standard formation twice. Aemilius Paulus used to say that seeing the phalanx in deployment was the most terrifying thing he ever witnessed. Now, the problem is that Romans could lose, but continue to raise more armies. A Hellenistic army can really only be beaten once or twice before the kingdom is threatened by instability because of the nature of how the successors recruited from pools of manpower. If a king was killed, well, then you have a potential civil war in your hands, whereas multiple consuls can die and new ones can just be elected by the people. I don't think history is so deterministic and set in stone. It wasn't inevitable that the Romans would emerge as the master of the Mediterranean, and I don't think we can cheapen their victories to describe it as merely throwing bodies at the problem until it went away. Their skill in building alliances that greatly improve their overall manpower allow them to hit way above their weight class. The equipment they wore was often better than their Hellenistic neighbors, and the logistics to support these larger numbers were quite good as well. I believe that no Hellenistic army could have defeated the Romans entirely after the First Punic War, without serious challenges. Their system was just too resilient. Even the Romans of the early 3rd century would have been formidable to Alexander. Pyrrhus of Epirus was supposed to be a general nearly equal in skill, who invaded Italy with an army that was functionally identical to that of Alexander's, and still barely managed to continue the war after winning 2 separate victories. So, I don't think there would have been any wholesale conquests after the First Punic War. Rome would have been too powerful and entrenched in its position, and the Hellenistic kingdoms in turn were not capable of handling that sort of threat if they continued to do damage to themselves like that. From Roberto of the History of Sarkartvelo, Georgia and Tsar Power. How do you think Antiochus III could have successfully countered the Romans had he not listened to them? The war between Antiochus and the Romans in some sense was a complete shock, given how poorly the Seleucids fared in the conflict. Antiochus had done very well in his anabasis in the 5th Syrian War, and with the largest empire in the known world, it should have been far more of an even fight, even with Rome's manpower capabilities. Antiochus, I think, failed on 3 key points. First, Antiochus did not expect the Romans to react the way they did, and seriously miscalculated his popularity in Greece. The Aetolians seem to have really misled his overview of the political situation in Greece. Rome had just liberated the entire Greek peninsula from Philip V, and engendered enormous goodwill from them. Some hiccups aside, they wanted to stay out of the way of Greek affairs unless it directly threatened them. Antiochus was the one to invade, and prompted the Roman reaction to invade with their own army, which would deliver them a moral victory rather than Antiochus' more aggressive actions. The king had jumped the gun and didn't invade with nearly enough manpower to take control, and therefore the Romans caught him off guard and pushed him back into Asia. Second, Antiochus fumbled badly with securing the necessary alliances that Rome had. Ignoring Rome's internal system of Latin and Italian allies, much of the Seleucid war effort was hampered by the key states of Rhodes, Pergamon, the Aegean League, and even Philip V of Macedon. Had they spent more time working with these states instead of antagonizing them, then the Romans would have not been able to rely on the legwork of these allies to either contest Seleucid naval power, such as what would happen with the Rhodians, attack his own allies, as would happen with Philip V against the Aetolians, or contribute forces to the battles, like Eumenes of Pergamon. The Senate would have had a harder time reasserting their control over Greece, and might have been hesitant to cross into Asia, which would have given Antiochus time to prepare. Thirdly, from a tactical point of view, the Battle of Magnesia was more of a Pergamene victory than a Roman one, but the deployment of scythe chariots was the catalyst for the Seleucid defeat. These things are absolutely terrible, and while they look cool, they not only failed in their purpose to disrupt enemy lines, they ended up running right back into their own lines and caused a domino effect which destabilized the Seleucid army for the battle. Had Antiochus' army not been thrown off kilter at the very start and met the Romano-Pergamene force head-on, it probably would have been a much more even match. But with all this in mind, I'm not sure if Antiochus could dedicate himself to a war in Greece without attracting the attention of the Romans, or even win one in the first place. But I think these mistakes sped up his defeat and caused a far worse outcome than what might have been a more evenly matched conflict, with Antiochus coming out with far better terms than that of the Peace of Apamea. From Joe.R9444444. What is your opinion on Antiochus IV Epiphanes? Do you think he was good for the Seleucid Empire? Since we are so close to covering Antiochus IV, I don't want to reveal my hand too much. However, in the short term, he was very competent. On top of his energetic penchants for administration and patronage, he was a very skilled general, nearly conquering Egypt outright and almost brought the Parthians to heel, before fate stepped in, which more or less kept the empire together as Antiochus III had bequeathed it. In the long term, the way he acquired the Seleucid throne came at the cost of overall legitimacy and the stability of the house, which set a trend that would weaken the empire until its eventual demise. He also pushed the subjects of Judea too harshly, perhaps not as a Hellenizer, but someone looking to take more control over the taxation policies, which led to incredibly bad PR from the world's most widely read book. From user SC5IV2RP2T, was Antony on the brink of becoming a Hellenistic king? Also, was medieval Byzantium the true last successor kingdom? But the real question was whether Augustus was a Hellenistic king in all but name. Antony's motivations behind the so-called donations of Alexandria are not so obvious, since we have pro-Octavian Roman propaganda to sort through, but his enthusiastic participation of the ceremonial pomp of the Ptolemaic court suggests that he very much enjoyed the role. Lots of the territories that he granted were neither under his control nor that of the Republic, so it may have been just a purely symbolic gesture used to legitimize Cleopatra, Caesarion, and the twins by tying their dynastic heritage of both Ptolemaic and Seleucid claims. Or it could have been a prelude to his campaigns in the East and his eventual claims, but we really just don't know. I can speak more confidently about Cleopatra's intentions, since I have read much more about her than I have Mark Antony, but my decision remains to be seen. With your second question, in some sense, the Roman Empire under Augustus and each subsequent emperor was indeed a Latin-flavored Hellenistic monarchy, and probably the most successful version of it. The image of a republic and prominence of the Senate remained a surprisingly powerful image centuries after it lost all true political meaning. But still, it was very much in the model of the Alexandrian successors. Governance in the early Principate up to the crisis of the 3rd century was run by a small staff of men closely tied to the emperor, and the imagery used in imperial propaganda found its predecessor in the art of the Hellenistic monarchies. Following the eventual movement of the capital from Rome to Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire was largely a Greek one, but that's a bit of a simplification. Up until the final days of the empire in 1453, the Byzantines would almost always describe themselves as Romanoi, not Hellenes, which is a relatively modern trend. This is absolutely a topic that I will discuss in the final episodes of the series, which will serve as an epilogue once we pass the death of Cleopatra, so I'm going to hold off on going in a deep dive for now. But this brings episode 100 to an end. And my throat is currently killing me, so I once again thank you all so much for contributing questions, for providing support these last number of years. Episode 101 will begin our series on the final days of the Antigonid dynasty in Macedon, so I bid you all farewell, and thank you all for listening to the Hellenistic Age podcast.